The flames painted the evening sky a cruel orange as Colton Griffin approached what remained of Benton, Wyoming. His dust-covered duster flapped in the hot wind, and his horse, a sturdy palomino named Dust, snorted nervously at the scent of burning timber. The year was 1877, and the West was still wild enough for a town to burn while neighboring settlements took days to hear about it. Colton had heard. He'd ridden for 2 days straight, hardly stopping to rest, after a passing rider brought news that Benton was ablaze. The same Benton where Lillian Zane had moved 3 months ago to teach at the newly built schoolhouse. He urged Dust forward, squinting against the smoke as he navigated the main street. Bodies lay in the dirt, some still clutching possessions they tried to save. Others had clearly been shot. This was no accident. He'd seen enough raids in his time to recognize the signs. Bandits had likely set the fire to cover their robbery of the town's small bank. "Lillian!" he called, his voice hoarse from the smoke and the miles. "Lil!" No answer came, just the crackle of flames devouring what remained of the general store. The schoolhouse was at the far end of town, and Colton prayed it had been spared. He rode past the smoldering remains of the saloon, the blacksmith's shop that was now just twisted metal tools and charred wood. A woman's scream cut through the roar of the fire, coming from what remained of the bank. The building was half collapsed, its facade blackened, but the sturdy brick walls still stood. Colton leaped from his horse, tied Dust to a post that seemed unlikely to catch fire, and drew his revolver. He kicked in what remained of the door and ducked inside. The smoke was thicker here, and he covered his mouth with a bandana as he moved deeper into the building. The sound came again, a whimper, followed by a cough. In the back office he found her. Lillian Zane was huddled in the corner, a makeshift mask of wet cloth pressed to her face. Her honey-brown hair was singed at the ends, her simple blue dress torn and dirty. She held a small pistol, pointing it shakily at him until recognition dawned in her eyes. "Colton?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is that really you?" "It's me, Lil." He holstered his gun and crouched beside her. "We need to get out of here. The roof won't hold much longer." A burning beam crashed somewhere in the front of the building, emphasizing his point. Lillian nodded, but then winced. "My ankle," she explained. "I think it's broken. I was hiding from the men who did this, and when they set the fire, I fell trying to escape." Colton didn't waste time. He scooped her up, mindful of her injury. "Hold on to me," he instructed, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. As he carried her toward the door, a section of ceiling collapsed, blocking their path. The heat was becoming unbearable, the smoke so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "There's a window in the clerk's office," Lillian said, pointing to a door on their right. Colton kicked it open and found the window she'd mentioned. It was small, but they could fit through. He set her down gently, used the butt of his gun to break the glass, and cleared the frame of shards. "I'll go first, then help you through," he said. Once outside, he lifted her again and carried her to where Dust waited. The horse was nervous, dancing sideways, eyes rolling at the flames, but he held steady as Colton managed to lift Lillian into the saddle. "Is there anyone else alive?" she asked, looking back at the burning buildings. Colton shook his head. "I haven't seen anyone. How many were there when the attack started?" "Maybe 30. Most ran when the shooting began. The bandits, there were at least a dozen. They herded some folks into the church." Her voice broke. "They locked the doors and set it alight." Colton's jaw tightened. He'd seen cruelty before, but this was beyond the pale. He mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist. As they turned to leave, a shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Dust's hooves. 3 riders emerged from the smoke at the far end of the street. Even at a distance, Colton recognized the leader, Wade Thornton, a notorious outlaw with a price on his head in 3 territories. "Ride," Colton whispered, spurring Dust into motion. They galloped through the burning town, more shots following them, but none finding their mark. Colton felt Lillian trembling against him and tightened his hold. You're all that's worth saving here, he said, his lips close to her ear as they cleared the town limits and rode into the darkening prairie. Behind them, Benton continued to burn, a funeral pyre for a town that had barely gotten started. Ahead lay uncertainty, but Colton knew one thing for certain: he wasn't letting Lillian out of his sight again. They rode for an hour before Colton felt it safe to stop. Lillian had grown quiet, occasionally stifling a sob. They found a small creek, and Colton helped her dismount, carrying her to sit on a flat rock while he tended to dust. "I thought I'd never see you again," Lillian said as he knelt to examine her ankle. It was swollen but not clearly broken. "Not after the way we parted." Colton soaked his bandana in the creek and wrapped it gently around her injury. "I was a fool, Lil. Too proud to admit I was wrong." The quarrel that had driven them apart now seemed petty. He'd been riding with a U.S. Marshal, hunting outlaws, when he met Lillian in her hometown of Silverton. She was educated, refined despite the frontier setting, her father having been a respected judge before his death. Colton was rough-edged, a former Confederate soldier who'd drifted west rather than return to a Georgia that no longer felt like home. They'd fallen in love quickly, surprising them both. But when she'd been offered the teaching position in Benton, Colton had refused to follow. His pride told him a man shouldn't trail after a woman, that she should be the one to stay. Now, looking at her soot-streaked face in the moonlight, he wondered how he could have been so stupid. "I'm sorry, Lil. For everything. When I heard about the fire, about Benton, His voice caught. "I thought I'd lost you for good." Lillian reached out, touching his cheek. "You came for me. That's what matters now." She winced as she shifted position, and Colton frowned. "We need to get you to a doctor. There's a settlement about 15 miles west Coopersville. It's small, but they have a doctor. Those men might follow us," Lillian said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Thornton and his gang, they've been terrorizing the area for months." The banker refused to give them access to the safe, so they killed him, took what they could from the tills, and decided to burn the evidence. "How did you survive?" "I was at the schoolhouse when it started. When I heard the shots, I hid the children in the cellar and told them to stay quiet. Then I went to find help, but one of the bandits saw me. I ran to the bank because it was the sturdiest building, thinking I could hide there until they left." She shuddered. "I didn't know they'd burn the whole town." "The children, are they still in the cellar?" Colton asked, alarm rising. Lillian shook her head. "No, some of the parents found them. I saw them escaping toward the hills before the bank caught fire. At least, I pray they all got out." Relief washed over him. "Let's rest a bit, then head to Coopersville. We can notify the marshal there, get a posse together." They made a small, sheltered fire, just enough to ward off the chill but not enough to be seen from a distance. Colton shared his meager provisions: jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. Lillian ate little but drank deeply. "I never stopped thinking about you," she admitted as they sat side by side, her head eventually finding its way to his shoulder. "Even when I was angriest, I missed you." Colton's arms circled her waist. "I rode out here to tell you I was wrong. That I'd follow you anywhere if you'd still have me." He paused. "I didn't expect to find Benton in flames. Life has a way of changing our plans," Lillian murmured, her eyes growing heavy. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch." She nodded, already drifting off. Colton held her as she slept, his eyes scanning the darkness, ears alert for the sound of approaching riders. But the night remained quiet, save for the occasional call of a coyote and the gentle babble of the creek. By dawn, they were moving again, Lillian seated in front of him on dust. Her ankle was still swollen, but she could move it more freely, suggesting it was just badly sprained. Colton kept them off the main trails, wary of an ambush. "Tell me about the children you teach," he said as they rode, partly to distract her from the pain, partly because he genuinely wanted to know about the life she'd built without him. "They're wonderful," Lillian said, a smile in her voice despite everything. "There's little Mary Ellen, who's only 6 but already reading better than some of the 12-year-olds. And the Thompson twins, who are absolute terrors but brilliant at arithmetic. She spoke of them with such fondness that Colton found himself envying the connection she had with these children he'd never met. He'd spent the last 3 months chasing outlaws with Marshal Dawson, sleeping on hard ground, eating questionable food, all while nursing a broken heart. "You're a natural teacher," he said. "I remember how you taught that Wilkins boy to read when his own pa had given up on him." Lillian laughed softly. "Johnny Wilkins. I wonder what became of him. Last I heard, he was working as a clerk in Denver. Seems your lesson stuck." They reached Coopersville by midday. It was a small settlement, just a dozen buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but it had the essentials: a general store, a saloon that doubled as an inn, and a doctor's office. Dr. Elias Peterson was a gruff man in his 50s, with a full beard streaked with gray and hands that looked too large for delicate work, yet moved with surprising gentleness as he examined Lillian's ankle. "Sprained, not broken," he confirmed. "Keep off it for a few days, wrap it tight, and you'll be fine." He glanced at Colton. "Your wife is lucky. From what you've told me about Benton, many weren't." Neither Colton nor Lillian corrected the assumption. Instead, Colton helped Lillian to the inn, where they secured a room. The innkeeper, a widow named Mrs. Guthrie, provided clean clothes for Lillian from her own wardrobe. "You poor dears," she clucked, setting a tray of food before them. "Rest up. Sheriff Donovan will want to talk to you when he returns from his rounds." Left alone, Lillian sank onto the bed with a sigh. "I can't believe they're gone. All those people. The Millers, who ran the general store. Old Mr. Finch, who played the piano at the church on Sundays." Colton sat beside her, taking her hand. "Thornton will pay for what he did. The law will see to that. Or you will?" There was a knowing look in her eyes. She remembered his sense of justice, how it drove him sometimes to take matters into his own hands. "The law should handle it," he said, though they both knew he'd step in if justice moved too slowly. Lillian squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you came for me, Colton. Even if it was to a burning town. I would have come sooner if I'd known you were in danger." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Donovan was a tall man with a handlebar mustache and eyes that had seen too much violence. He listened intently as Lillian recounted the attack on Benton. "Thornton," he spat when she mentioned the leader. "Been after him for months. He hit Riverside last month, but they didn't burn it to the ground." He glanced at Colton. "You said you're riding with Marshal Dawson?" Colton nodded. "Was. We parted ways in Silverton when he got called back east. Well, I could use a man like you. I'm gathering a posse tomorrow at dawn. Thornton and his boys were spotted heading toward the Badlands. If we move fast, we might catch them before they disappear into that maze." Colton looked at Lillian, torn. He didn't want to leave her, not when he just found her again, but the thought of Thornton escaping justice made his blood boil. "Go," she said softly, reading his thoughts. "I'll be safe here. And those families deserve justice." Reluctantly, Colton agreed to ride with the posse. That night, he and Lillian shared the small bed in their room, though they did nothing more than hold each other, both too physically and emotionally exhausted for anything else. "Promise me you'll come back," Lillian whispered as they lay in the darkness. "I promise." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "And when I do, I want us to start over. No more foolish pride keeping us apart." She nodded against his chest, and soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Colton stayed awake longer, memorizing the feel of her in his arms, afraid it might be the last time he held her. Dawn came too quickly. The posse consisted of Sheriff Donovan, Colton, and 5 other men from Coopersville: a blacksmith, 2 ranchers, the general store owner, and a young man barely out of his teens who had a personal grudge against Thornton's gang for killing his brother. Lillian saw them off, standing on the inn's porch with Mrs. Guthrie. She didn't cry, but her eyes spoke volumes as she pressed a small token into Colton's palm, a simple wooden charm her father had carved for her years ago. "For luck," she said. "Bring it back to me." Colton tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, then leaned down from the saddle to kiss her. "I will," he promised. The posse rode hard, following tracks that led northeast toward the Badlands. Thornton's gang had been careless, perhaps believing no one had survived to pursue them. By nightfall, they'd closed the gap considerably. "We'll catch them tomorrow," Sheriff Donovan predicted as they made camp. "They're heading for Razorback Ridge. There's only one way through, and we can cut them off if we ride at first light." That night, as the others slept, Colton took first watch. He sat on a rock overlooking their small camp, his rifle across his knees, thoughts drifting to Lillian. He'd been a fool to let her go once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Morning brought them to the ridge, where they split up to cover both sides of the narrow pass. Colton positioned himself behind a boulder, watching as dust in the distance signaled the approach of riders. 8 of them, Sheriff Donovan muttered from nearby. 4 short of a full dozen. Some must have split off. The outlaws entered the pass, unaware of the trap. When they were halfway through, Sheriff Donovan fired a warning shot. "Thornton! This is Sheriff Donovan. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender!" For a moment, it seemed they might comply. The riders halted, looking around warily. Then Thornton, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, drew his gun and fired. The pass erupted in gunfire. Colton took careful aim, dropping one outlaw, then another. Around him, the posse was doing the same. But Thornton and his men were hardened killers. They returned fire with deadly accuracy. The young man from Coopersville was the first to fall, a bullet catching him in the chest. Then one of the ranchers took a hit to the shoulder. Colton kept firing, working his way closer to where Thornton had taken cover behind his fallen horse. A bullet grazed Colton's arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning trail across his skin. He ignored it, focused entirely on reaching Thornton, who was now attempting to escape on foot up a narrow trail. "Thornton!" Colton shouted, giving chase. The outlaw turned, firing wildly. Colton felt a bullet whiz past his ear, too close for comfort. He returned fire, his shot catching Thornton in the leg. The outlaw stumbled but kept moving, disappearing around a bend in the trail. Colton followed cautiously, aware he was leaving the main fight behind. The trail led to a small plateau overlooking the pass. Thornton was waiting, his gun aimed. "You're the one who took the girl," he said, recognition flashing in his eyes. "From Benton. You'll answer for what you did there." Colton replied, his own gun steady despite the anger coursing through him. Thornton laughed, a harsh sound. "I've answered for nothing so far. What makes you think today's any different?" He fired, the bullet striking a rock near Colton's head, sending fragments flying. Colton felt a sting as one caught him in the cheek, but he held his ground, returning fire. His shot hit Thornton in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The outlaw looked surprised, then angry. He raised his gun again, but the strength was leaving him. His shot went wide, and Colton's next bullet found its mark. Thornton fell, his gun clattering on the rocky ground. Colton approached cautiously, kicking the weapon away before checking for a pulse. There was none. Wade Thornton, the scourge of the territory, was dead. When Colton returned to the pass, the fight was over. 3 of Thornton's men were dead, the rest captured. The posse had lost the young man and one of the ranchers, with Sheriff Donovan nursing a bullet wound to his thigh. "Thornton?" the sheriff asked, wincing as the blacksmith bound his injury. "Dead," Colton confirmed. They buried their dead there, marking the graves with stone cairns, before beginning the journey back to Coopersville. The captured outlaws were bound and placed on horses, under close guard. It was a somber return. The victory felt hollow in the face of their losses, but there was relief too. Thornton would terrorize no more settlements, burn no more towns, take no more lives. Lillian was waiting when they rode in, her face lighting up when she spotted Colton. She limped out to meet them, ignoring her still tender ankle. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the bandage on his arm and the cut on his cheek. "Nothing serious," he assured her, dismounting to take her in his arms. "I kept my promise." He reached into his pocket, retrieving her wooden charm, now bearing a small nick where a bullet had grazed it. She took it with a gasp, running her fingers over the mark. "It saved you," she whispered. "You saved me," he corrected. "Knowing you were waiting gave me something to fight for, something to come back to." That night, after the prisoners were secured and the town had celebrated the posse's success with a hastily arranged dinner at the inn, Colton and Lillian sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge. "What happens now?" Lillian asked, her hand in his. "Benton is gone. The school, the children. I spoke with Sheriff Donovan. The families from Benton have scattered, some to Coopersville, others to larger settlements. But there's talk of rebuilding, once the weather turns cooler and the risk of fire is less." He turned to face her. "Or we could go somewhere else entirely. Start fresh." "Together this time?" "Together," he affirmed. "I was thinking about California. They're building schools in every new town, and they could use good teachers." Lillian considered this, her head tilted to one side. "California is a long way." "Too far?" She smiled, shaking her head. "Not too far. But I was thinking. What about Silverton? They're expanding the school there, and they asked me to come back before I chose Benton instead." Silverton, where they'd first met. Where they'd fallen in love. There was poetry in returning to begin again. "Silverton it is," Colton agreed. They married 3 days later, in a simple ceremony at Coopersville's small church. Mrs. Guthrie provided a wedding dress, altered from one of her daughter's gowns. Sheriff Donovan, still recovering from his wound, gave the bride away. They left for Silverton the following morning, their few possessions packed on dust and a mare Colton had purchased from one of the ranchers. The journey would take them through rough country, but they faced it together, unafraid. Silverton welcomed them back with open arms. The town had grown in their absence, with new buildings along Main Street and the promised expansion to the schoolhouse nearly complete. Lillian was immediately offered a teaching position, and Colton found work as a deputy to the local marshal, his experience hunting outlaws proving valuable. They rented a small house on the edge of town, with a view of the mountains and enough land for a garden and a few animals. Colton built a porch swing similar to the one at Mrs. Guthrie's inn, and many evenings found them there, talking about their day as the sun set. News eventually reached them that Benton was indeed being rebuilt, though on a smaller scale. Some of the survivors had returned, determined to reclaim their home from the ashes. Lillian corresponded with a few of her former students, pleased to learn they were continuing their education. A year after their return to Silverton, Lillian discovered she was expecting. Their daughter, Eleanor, was born in the spring of 1879, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. A son, James, followed 2 years later, completing their family. The wooden charm that had saved Colton's life hung in their home, a reminder of all they had overcome. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the children were asleep, they would talk about Benton, about the fire, about how close they had come to losing each other forever. "I still see it in my dreams sometimes," Lillian admitted one such night, as they sat on their porch swing. "The flames, the people running. But then I see you, riding through the smoke to find me." Colton pulled her closer. "I'd ride through fire for you any day, Lil. You're worth saving, always." They had built a good life in Silverton. Lillian's school flourished, and she eventually became its headmistress. Colton served as deputy for 5 years before being elected marshal when his predecessor retired. Their children grew strong and kind, a perfect blend of their parents' best qualities. The West was changing around them. The railroad came through Silverton in 1883, bringing more settlers, more commerce. The town grew from a frontier outpost to a proper community, with a bank, a newspaper, and even a small theater. But some things remained constant: the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, the changing of the seasons, and the love between a former cowboy and the schoolteacher he'd ridden through fire to save. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they returned to the site where Benton had once stood. The town had never fully recovered, with just a handful of buildings marking what had once been a promising settlement. A monument had been erected listing the names of those lost in the fire. They stood before it in silence, Lillian's hand in Colton's, both remembering that terrible day. Then they turned away, riding back toward Silverton, toward home, leaving the past behind while carrying its lessons with them. "No regrets?" Colton asked as they crossed the ridge that would take them out of sight of Benton's remains. Lillian smiled, the years having added character to her beauty but dimmed none of its radiance. "None," she assured him. "Every step, every decision, led us here, together. How could I regret that?" Colton leaned over to kiss her, as in love now as he had been when he'd first seen her in Silverton all those years ago, before the fire, before the separation, before the reunion that had changed everything. They were no longer young, but they had years ahead of them, still years to watch their children grow into adulthood, to welcome grandchildren, to sit on their porch swing and count the stars. Years built on the foundation of that moment when a cowboy had ridden into a burning town and found the woman who was, to him, all that was worth saving. And save her he had. They had saved each other.